Excellent. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Christine Hess, and I am the Executive Director for the Nevada Housing Coalition, our statewide nonprofit to advance and promote affordable housing. I just want to quickly introduce, and Amanda, if you want to give a wave, my teammate Amanda here, she's going to be monitoring the chat and just helping facilitate and grab questions as we go. So if you have questions, again, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll be looking for those. For those just learning about the Nevada Housing Coalition, we are a member-based organization and our members are very much just like our board, North and South in Nevada, urban and rural, public and private. So it really is a fantastic organization to hear from a lot of different perspectives as we discuss affordable housing and the challenges and complexities that come with it. The Lunch and Learn is a monthly series, and we're going to kick this year off with a conversation around our affordable housing resources, and particularly around some financial resources. And I thought it would be great to start around the American Rescue Plan Act. I just want to quickly note for everyone, one thing that's outstanding is we are monitoring the Build Back Better Act. Right now it is stalled in Congress. And we have reached out to our congressional delegates, just urging them to keep fighting for the housing provisions. With Nevada's growth coming after the last major investment in housing, we really need those funds to support the long-term efforts and long-term solutions for housing. So we'll all just be keeping an eye on that. But what we do have control over and are very fortunate to have awesome leaders in our state working hard, working collaboratively, which I like with the Nevada Recovers Tour, is the Nevada Treasurer and his team. Eric, give a wave because behind the scenes, Eric is amazing. But our Nevada State Treasurer, Zach Conine, has been a fearless leader around housing. And we asked Treasurer Conine if he could just talk to the group about where the state is on its American Rescue Plan Act funds, perhaps shed light on the housing opportunities, but not necessarily, more just an overview. Additionally, to talk about the State Infrastructure Bank, which is an innovative tool and resource and new for affordable housing in our state, potentially, as we move through this open comment period. So Treasurer Conine.
Thanks, Christine, and thanks for having me. And as always, thanks to all of you for joining the Nevada Housing Coalition in this shockingly important work. You know, it's been my pleasure to speak in front of this group a few times over the last couple of months, and I'll try not to repeat things I've said before, but Christine's going to help me facilitate questions at the end, and so that'll give us an opportunity to dive deeper into anything if I don't cover it. On the ARPA front, our first phase was collecting information, and that's the work that my team and I did with the help of the governor's office and the legislature and the rest, going around the state and getting thousands of ideas in many different topics on many different things that Nevadans need in order to build the state that they deserve. You know, we've got finally a final rule. We're going to hear a little bit more about that later from Ms. Bondi, which is fantastic. But we've got a final rule. We have some real information about what kind of sandbox we're living in on ARPA. And certainly there are still some questions, but we know we've got a lot of flexibility, a lot of opportunity in front of us. We also know that some of that money is really, really flexible and some of that money is a lot less flexible. We also know that we've got an infrastructure bill and hopefully Build Back Better to plan around as well. And so the needs assessment that our office created through the Every Nevadan Recovers a Listening Tour, the goal there, right, is to give the governor and the legislature the information they need as they go forward and make priorities and a spending plan using those dollars. And so one of the things we heard loud and clear, not just from this group, but in every community around the state, was how important housing is. Not just housing as a human right, but housing as an economic driver, right? And making sure that if our economy is to recover in the way that it seems to be right now, we need to make sure that housing is there for that long-term stability. And so I expect you'll hear more from the governor's office in the next couple of weeks. And I definitely think that housing is a big priority of his, of mine, of the legislatures, of everyone else. And so I'm hopeful that housing is a big piece of the solution. And so I wanted to thank you all for the time that you've spent advocating for that, for the work that went into one of the most comprehensive proposals that actually came in of the 36 or so hundred proposals that came in. So congratulations, Christine, not that you're surprised there. But one of the things I wanted to talk about today, because I think we all kind of have a general idea of what's going on with ARPA, but happy to answer any questions, is some other work we're doing on the housing front, because we know that the housing solution isn't just throwing money at it. The housing solution is finding innovative ways where we can leverage capital and resources that already exist most effectively. And so I need to take a little time machine. We're going to go back real briefly to 2017. I was not in elected office. I was in the private sector. It was relatively nice on the private sector. Didn't get as many angry emails, I suppose, but also wasn't verified on Twitter. So pros and cons. Okay. So in 2017, the State Infrastructure Bank was set up, and the goal there was to create jobs and much needed investment in infrastructure around our state. Now, that bank was set up originally, if everyone remembers, this is when we started waiting for Infrastructure Week. Infrastructure Week never came. The funding that was supposed to go into the bank never showed up. And so this bank was set up basically for utility and transportation projects, and like many good ideas in state government that don't have any money behind them were put into a binder, thrown on a shelf, and no one did anything. So that bank didn't attract any money, didn't fund a single project. Now, knowing that the federal government was going to make a serious investment in infrastructure, we knew we had to get the bank stood up to leverage those federal dollars, as well as other outside capital to get projects off the ground as quickly as possible. Now, in my role as the state's chief investment officer, we're talking to pension funds and investors. We're looking at fixed income assets around the world every day. And one of the things we realized was that there's a fair amount of capital on the sidelines looking for infrastructure investments, but Nevada didn't have a mechanic to actually get that capital into it. So it was going to other places in other countries. And so we passed a bill in the last legislative session to expand the infrastructure bank. The infrastructure bank broadly is designed to offer low interest loans to qualified borrowers, local governments, tribal governments, nonprofit organizations. And in the last session, the expansion that we did took it from just transportation and utility to social infrastructure, which for this group is probably most important because that includes housing and food security, healthcare access, digital infrastructure, water, renewable energy, recycling and sustainability infrastructure, and other infrastructure necessary for economic development, which broadly means that we can use the bank for anything as long as it makes sense to Nevadans. Now, we also, and this is going to get really in the weeds, so I'll try not to go too deep and too boring here, but stick with me. Christine, make a motion if people are falling asleep because I can't see them. So the state has a credit rating, right? The state's credit rating is the highest it's ever been since I became treasurer. Now that allows us to borrow more money at lower rates. Great. We were able to use our skills in the Treasury to create another $100 million of bond cap. Now that means that the state was able to borrow $100 million more than it was able to borrow the built biennium beforehand. 75 million of those dollars went to capitalize the bank for the first time. So now the state infrastructure bank has $75 million of dry powder it can use to try to make the state a little bit better. And as I said, while we were doing the Nevada Recovers listening tour, we heard from every community that housing was a top priority. Rising rents, rising house prices, lack of supply of housing, not just at the market rate, but in the affordable nature. And then of course, just an absolute dearth of properties, way under AMI and that 20-30% AMI. There's almost nothing out there. And we knew that the process for expanding ARPA was going to take time, not just because the final rule hadn't come out when we started that process, but also because we got tens of billions of dollars of requests for funding, and there's only so much money that came in through ARPA. So we had to stand up a vehicle to encourage long-term investment into more affordable housing that would still be there once all the ARPA dollars are expended. That's why we're starting with a $20 million piece of the state infrastructure bank, which will set up an affordable housing investment trust within that bank that will provide loans and other financial assistance to support the development of new and refurbished affordable housing. Now, that $20 million, that's a lot of money for the state of Nevada, but it's not enough to fix this problem. And so with everything in the bank, we are looking for ways to leverage a little bit of state money into a much larger portion of actual dollars. And so that's where we're working with the AFL-CIO's Housing Investment Trust. And I see there's a couple of our friends from the Housing Investment Trust on this. Thanks for joining us. To leverage that bank's $20 million with hundreds of millions of dollars of outside capital to get projects off the ground beginning this year. The AFL's HIT is a $7 billion pension fund that invests in traditional mortgage-backed securities to help finance and construct affordable housing projects in 29 states around the country. They've been responsible for 562 projects nationwide, $9.7 billion in total investment, more than 200,000 jobs nationwide, and they've created more than 122,000 housing units, more than 2/3 of them affordable. Now, this set aside within the bank will be designed to attract pension fund investments in the creation and rehabilitation of affordable housing in Nevada, while aiding in job creation in the building and construction trades. Well, we talked about that originally $75 million in the bank. Our projections is that the bank will create 30,000 jobs in Nevada over the next 10 years if we get this right. And this is a good first step. Funds through that program are going to serve as gap financing for developers who are committed to creating careers in construction for affordable multifamily rental housing workers. Program funds are going to supplement first mortgage debt from the pension fund, so the state will come in a second position for construction and permanent financing, tax credit equity, as well as other forms of financing required to make the development of affordable housing financially viable. Now, the bank is currently in a public comment period for the establishment of this set aside for affordable housing, and we would deeply appreciate all of your feedback, saying that you appreciate the state going forward and spending money on affordable housing, but also if there are specific things that we could do better in our plan to set aside that money, let us know. You can do that by emailing us at ask@nevadatreasurer.gov. That's ask@nevadatreasurer.gov. And I see there's a question, what's the definition of affordable housing? So we typically use the definition of affordable housing that lets us access those tax credits. So in the 60% AMI range or less, so of average median income for that area. So affordable housing in Reno is obviously different than affordable housing in Clark, which is different than affordable housing in our rural communities. But that's how we typically think about it. That's what we're committed to in your Treasury. So happy to take any questions on that, Christine, or on literally anything else, specifically unclaimed property. If anybody has unclaimed property questions, I always get it. No, nothing.
Yeah, are you ready to look that up for people?
You got it. We can go real quick.
You are. Well, I just want to, I was in person for the presentation and the information presented by AFL-CIO and the investments around the country. I can't wait to see those investments here in Nevada, right? Why not Nevada? So really exciting to have a new tool, an innovative tool, and something that we aren't currently doing. So thanks for the hard effort to put this in place. I think really the affordable housing question, and for everybody here, your information. And we do have a question from the Q&A that I'll address as well. But in Nevada, in statute, we actually define tier 1 income levels as below 60% of area median income, so that we can understand the affordable housing that we're prioritizing. Treasurer, question in the Q&A box asks if you're considering workforce housing as well.
Yes.
So, and traditionally workforce housing would be at a slightly higher percentage of area median income if you wanted to qualify. In my world, it's all affordable housing, but often we hear workforce housing in that way.
And in the Treasury, we believe the solution to having more housing is in fact building more housing, right? So if that housing is workforce housing or affordable housing or housing for individuals who don't have those resources, et cetera, we're in favor of it. As long as it's environmentally conscious and pays a good living wage to build.
Great. Another question in the chat. Will any funds go towards building housing places for those specifically with mental illness in Nevada?
It's a real big conversation right now. We know there's a massive dearth, as I said, in facilities for individuals with mental illness, as well as transitional facilities, facilities for children coming out of the foster care system, et cetera, et cetera. All of those ideas are on the table. And I know that the housing department in the state is working tirelessly. I expect Steve or Michael are here to make sure that that can get done.
Great. And my goodness, we could probably spend the whole lunch and learn on this. There's a lot of questions in the chat. And Eric, if you want to address in the chat, but I do want to, I think this is a really timely question since we have the open comment period now, is when will the State Infrastructure Bank launch and how do organizations apply for the funds?
So great question. So the State Infrastructure Bank has launched now, started on July 1st, I believe, Eric will nod, July 1st of 2021, which we're excited about. I have the pleasure of being the chair of that group, and you can always reach out to us for ideas. So the first 3 things we're doing are set aside, right? And so that allows us to create programs within that area. But we get reach outs every day, both from the commercial side, from the residential side, non-housing advocates for ways that the bank could potentially help either their industry or their work. Always happy to have those conversations and figure out what the best way is to do it. We're really focused at the bank right now on leveraging outside capital, right? We want to make sure that every dollar that the state spends becomes $2 or $3 or $10, as opposed to just kind of a one-to-one. Separate thing, and I suppose I should mention it just as the chairman of a bank, we are a bank, right? We're in the loan business, not the grant business. And so our part of our underwriting process is determining who is going to be able to pay us back and how does that work. I see a question from David, I believe, about low interest rates. So the state actually, because of our high credit rating, again, highest in state history, in case anyone didn't catch that the first two times, our state credit rating allows us to borrow money much, much, much cheaper than we ever had. In fact, the last time we borrowed money in December, it was about 1.83%. This will be a little bit more expensive because it's likely to be taxable, but it will be a lot lower than what anyone is able to borrow in the private sector.
Awesome. And we have a lot of questions. I do want to give just a little time as well for the ARPA funds, which I have one question, but in here there was a question, my goodness. There are a lot of questions for you. Ooh, mobile homes, would those be considered manufactured? I would assume depending on the median income they serve and the type of application that comes in.
Yeah, that's a great question, but yes, I don't see why not.
Prevailing wage, will that play a part with the infrastructure bank, and then we can also transition to ARPA?
Yes, and so one of the both on the ARPA front and on the state front, one of the intentions of those projects is to make sure that the people who are building them have good middle class jobs and can support for their family. And so we're obviously deeply in support of prevailing wage and other programs. These are state dollars going into the program, so they're subject to all the spending around labor agreements and the rest that the rest of state dollars are.
Awesome. And there's a lot of other questions, but I highly encourage, Amanda posted the link to the meeting, and the AFL-CIO and Northern Nevada Building Trades did an excellent presentation at that meeting, and their materials are included online as well. So I highly encourage everyone to visit that. Treasurer, do you just have another minute or two around ARPA?
Yeah, sure.
Great, thanks. One question I have is, how much money do we have left? Right? I love it when you talk about the Friday in June where you got all the money in the account. But how much is left?
It's a great question for the governor's office. We know how much cash is left, but the real question is how much has been allocated through different programs. And of course, there's been quite a bit of spending in the last couple of weeks with Omicron response and the rest. Yeah,
unfortunately, the pandemic is still certainly causing urgent needs, no doubt, all around our state.
Agreed.
Excellent. Let me just flip through here real quick. If a client has a question regarding ARPA funds, do you have a point of contact we can refer them to and an email address? And obviously for the state funds.
Yeah, for the state funds, I suggest reaching out to the governor's office. Bailey Bordeland's taken the lead on that front.
Excellent. Awesome. And for everybody's information on a process right now, we have the Interim Finance Committee that is ultimately approving, and please correct me, Eric, Treasurer, if I'm wrong, but that's right, ultimately approving the recommendations of potential funds for the ARPA. Is that not, am I correct there?
That is.
And that was established at the end of the legislative session last year. Interim Finance Committee will be meeting February 9th. So we should see more coming through then. Excellent. Well, I think there's probably a lot of questions here. Eric, if you have time and can get to them, a lot of the questions are more general. And I would tell you that the affordable housing presentation that was made for the State Infrastructure Bank is just really helpful. And it's also worth listening to as a new tool as we in the industry consider how we leverage additional funds, which I love, bringing in new funds to the state or leveraging what we may not be leveraging already. So thank you so much. Thanks, Treasurer.
Of course, happy to help, and thanks for all the work that you do. And thanks to all of our housing partners. I see that I'm sure I didn't say hi to everybody, but appreciative of you all.
Yes, thank you so much. And I just want to tee up the next conversation for all of us around the Nevada Housing Coalition. Oh, here we go. Around the Nevada Housing Coalition recommendation. The Treasurer did reference it, and the Nevada Housing Coalition in September submitted a recommendation that the state invest $500 million of its fiscal recovery funds in affordable housing, in infrastructure, right? Housing is these are long-term assets that will benefit generations of Nevadans. We didn't only recommend $500 million of the state's fiscal recovery funds, but we also divided it into 4 buckets that you'll see here on the screen: $275 million for multifamily, $125 million for preservation, $50 million for affordable home ownership, and $50 million for land. And Amanda's going to drop a link in the chat so you can see the full recommendation as well. But this recommendation from us right now, we are doing what everybody else around the country is doing, and we're taking a look at our recommendation per Treasury's final rule. So a couple weeks ago, so these funds don't come through HUD, which we often think of housing investments when they're coming from our federal government as coming from HUD. These funds actually flow through the US Treasury. So everybody was waiting for Treasury's final rule, which was released about 2 weeks ago, and it's 437 pages. So everybody is also still sifting through it, and it's very complex. And while it does answer some questions, it also raises more questions. And we here at the coalition are collecting those questions so that we can compile and get Nevada's perspective and pass that along to our congressional delegates, to our HUD office for US Treasury. So with that, however, I did also invite an expert, Melissa Bondi, there she is, from Enterprise Community Partners. And for everybody not familiar with Enterprise is a national nonprofit and just amazing expertise in terms of development, advocacy. I depend on them. Thanks to Charles Schwab Bank, I access Enterprise and their technical assistance almost weekly. But I did reach out to Enterprise to see if they could provide some insights into how they've interpreted the final rule and what that might mean for affordable housing development and uses right here in Nevada. So I'll turn it over to you, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Christine. Thanks so much for inviting me, and hello to everyone on the webinar. I am Melissa Bondi. I'm a policy director here at Enterprise, and we have been going through the 437-page document. So this is really going to be a very quick snapshot of our preliminary understanding. We know that there are lots of elements within the final rule that were intended to provide clarity, and yet we always have questions. What will be eligible? How can this be used? How does page 16 and page 66 work together? So please note that what we'll be sharing today is a brief synopsis of what we think we know, but we all reserve the right to ask more questions and I won't say expect, but to hope that there may be additional guidance documents that come out to provide further clarity on the kinds of questions that are raised all across the country by housing affordability providers, as well as those who work in all the other areas that are touched by the state and local fiscal recovery funds. So with that giant caveat, let's talk about what we think we know. The interim guidelines for how to use the funds was published last May, and the final rule was published a little bit earlier this month in January. The final rule, all of the engagement from the January document, will not be considered kind of in effect until April 1st, 2022. What that means is it gives time for beneficiaries of the funds to actually look at how they might want to adjust or expand their programs as a result of the final rule, which is intended to provide greater clarity, greater flexibility, and greater compliance with the rules. With that said, before April 1st, all of the interim guidelines that we've been operating under since last year are still in effect. And as of April 1, when the new rules go into effect, if you were in compliance prior to April 1 with the interim guidelines, you're good. You don't have to worry about trying to retroactively fit guidelines that were not provided until January of 2022. But as a practical matter, if you want to start redesigning or updating your application of programs for fund use to comply with the new rules, you're welcome to do so. So the Treasury is trying to make it easy for folks not to be too confused by when or under what circumstances those new rules apply. With that said, the intention of the final rule is to help ensure that the remainder of the $350 billion total that were allocated in the Fiscal Recovery Funds are able to get on the street. They solicited and received more than 1,500 public comments from the interim guidelines on how to make adjustments, and their intention is generally to provide more clarity, flexibility, and greater eligibility of programs that might be covered. We have about $110 billion remaining out of the entire federal allocation that has not yet been kind of dispersed. So we have more than half the money on the street, and hopefully the remainder will be able to be outfitted presently. So what's in the rule? Under the final rulemaking, all eligible uses in fiscal recovery funds are in 4 major buckets. One of those relates generally to housing and housing affordability issues. The 4 are replacing lost public sector revenue, certainly of interest to the governments themselves, premium pay provisions for workers, water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. And then the 4th category is called public health and economic impacts. Housing affordability is in this one, public health and economic impacts. And that's because use of funds for capital expenditures to support public health or economic response explicitly includes certain affordable housing and related provisions. So when you're looking at the 437-page document, just look at public health and economic impact, and you'll get to the housing provisions. What are some of the key changes? One of the major ones that has been talked about before, and certainly folks may be aware of, is the fact that for all uses of state and fiscal local recovery funds, we are looking at buckets of eligibility for those communities that have been impacted, and then those that have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And there are explicit guidelines in the final rule defining by income and by other eligible categories who fits in impacted versus disproportionately impacted communities. One of the big questions that we still have about the rule is whether or not anyone who is disproportionately impacted is eligible for all of the provisions that are also true for those who are just impacted. Does impacted apply to everybody? And then there are certain carve outs for those who are extremely low income and have even more need for resources in the disproportionately impacted category. So we don't yet have clarity, excuse me, on whether or not something needs to be explicitly allowed in both places in order for it to be eligible. So that's an example of something that we'll probably be asking. But overall, for housing affordability, that is an important kind of lens to think through what kinds of eligible programs apply and to whom might they apply on the basis of their income level. I have all the income level information. People have questions about that, but in the interest of time, I'll move on, I'll move forward. There's also additional information about the kinds of housing programs, housing projects, and kind of housing uses that were allowed in the interim rule in May. Those, for the very large majority, remain, and then a couple more have been expanded, but they are all denominated in the idea of addressing housing insecurity, lack of housing affordability supply, and programs that would increase access to housing among individuals experiencing homelessness. And for those who are experiencing homelessness, they may have dual diagnosis, they may have additional needs for which additional state and local fiscal recovery funds might be available to help them for direct service wraparound. As a practical matter, what we have seen on the capital side for those who are looking to finance projects is that although it was requested by multiple national advocacy organizations, the fiscal recovery funds are not explicitly eligible for use to provide gap financing for housing credit or LIHTC projects that have been delayed as a result of the pandemic, that might have had increased costs, labor shortages, things like that. That was a really big item that was requested. But there are a couple of different elements to how to make the money from the fiscal recovery funds eligible for housing credit projects, and those are not included in the final rule as best we can tell. That being said, there are capital expenditures that are appropriate to use. And for any projects that would otherwise have been eligible for funding under federal programs like the National Housing Trust Fund, the Home Investment Partnerships Program, which we know of as HOME, for example, they are also eligible for state and local fiscal recovery funds. So we have that going for us. In the interest of time, I'll try to sum up, but as a practical matter, there are summary documents that talk about all of these eligible uses. Enterprise will probably be publishing guidance on this fairly soon. We know that there are a bunch of questions that are coming forward, but we've seen nothing in the final rule thus far that suggests that some of the best practices that states have been employing for how to use resource, including the ones that were outlined in the Nevada Housing Coalition's recommendations, those all still seem to be very eligible. The devil's in the details. Putting money into a housing trust fund is a great idea, but for which projects is it eligible? How many people of disproportionate impact who are extremely low income will be benefiting versus those who are, say, impacted? Things like that are the devil in the details we'll need help with. But across the country, what we've seen from multiple states is a lot of resources being put directly into supporting assisting tenants in making payments, doing affordable housing investment related to those eligible uses in the final rule, looking at alternative forms of rental assistance programs, supportive housing, and certainly a very large number in homelessness initiatives, just because they tend to have the greatest need at the greatest expense per person for support. And this is such a large amount of money, you can actually accomplish some things in homelessness because you get a lot of cash up front. So those are really the areas of emphasis. There's so much more that we could talk about. You may have questions, but as a practical matter, I'll turn it back over to Christine. And thank you so much for letting me provide that very, very simple overview.
Yeah, Melissa, if we can go ahead with a little Q&A, I could take up the whole thing, by the way. But please, anybody, if you have a question for Melissa, please feel free to use the chat. A couple of questions to start. Can you actually just kind of detail out a little better the income levels that were considered impacted, right? Where we have to have a little bit less rigor around showing their eligibility?
Yes. So one of the great things in the final rule is an acknowledgement by Treasury that there are other federal programs that do a really good job of defining those who are extremely low income, very low income, or have been already proven to be or anticipated to be impacted or disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And what the final rule says as a blanket is, because there are other federal definitions that acknowledge these populations have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, you don't need to prove affirmatively to us that these same folks are affected by the pandemic for purposes of applying SLFRF. You can use Fiscal Recovery Funds saying, hey, we already have them in a different program, and that program certainly meets the definition that is acknowledged by the federal government writ large. So it's trying to de-silo the notion that if someone was eligible for National Housing Trust Fund dollars in a project, then they're also eligible for fiscal recovery funds for that same project. You can't use the money from two different sources to pay for exactly the same thing in that project, but the population's being served. So that takes a little bit of burden, I think, off of state and local governments that otherwise in the interim guidelines and before had felt a lot of pressure to make sure that vulnerable populations were actually meeting this definition when they're already receiving, say, earned income tax credits, or they're already receiving or meeting other definitions. But this notion of impacted and disproportionately impacted categories is denominated in terms of income largely. So an impacted community is a low or moderate income household, and as a majority of communities, those whose incomes are at or below 300% of federal poverty guidelines relative to their household size. For a household of 3, the national standard for federal poverty is $65,880. If you would like to use a different test, the alternative test for impacted communities are those making at or below 65% of the area median income. And so you can go for either one. And then for disproportionately impact, those who are extremely low income, the most vulnerable in our communities, it's 185% of federal poverty guidelines, which is for a household of 3, about $40,600 across the country. The alternative for AMI is at 40% of AMI. And so if you are looking at trying to provide housing supports for those who are not otherwise qualified or eligible in an existing federal program that would kind of convey in to this final rule, because Treasury doesn't want to make you have to prove things twice. Those are really the income categories: 300% of federal poverty, or 65% AMI, or the 185% of federal poverty and 40% of AMI.
Thanks, Melissa. And from my perspective, as I think about the state and the opportunities that the state may be considering, and then I'll put relative to housing, that does help us to streamline our efforts and hopefully even deploy the funds and get them activated in our communities more quickly, with, of course, a timeline of 2026.
That's right. That's right. We want to get all that money spent if we can by 2026. I'll also say that there's flexibility built into the final rule that says, Treasury created a tool. The tool is a data tool to help communities determine where their low and moderate income households are located. It's kind of a geodata tool that's available. And I can put a link to that in the chat if that's helpful, or I can send it, Christine and Amanda, to you for redistribution if folks haven't already seen it. And then the second thing that is, recipients may also identify other populations, other groups that they can demonstrate have shown pandemic impacts. So if you think that there are cohorts or there are projects that you think are worthy of fiscal recovery funds that meet the spirit of what's in the final rule, but that don't otherwise meet the presumed definitions, you don't have to prove it, you can request approval for it. So that flexibility is built into the final rule, thankfully. Doesn't guarantee you'll get a yes, but at least you know you can ask.
Great. This question was posted earlier and I did see it, and it could be a state infrastructure bank question, but it's definitely for me also an ARPA question, because I believe the final rule did help clarify this around adaptive reuse and or vacant buildings. It seems, if I'm interpreting the final rule correctly, we have a bit of an expanded eligible use that targets that category. Is that correct? Or is that still up for debate?
Well, I think our hope is that it is an expanded use. One of the kind of overall questions is, does that expanded use kind of apply to all of the, is it for impacted communities? Is it for disproportionately impacted communities, or both? Are there other conditions that need to be met in order for it to apply? Does it apply to anything that you might want to do an expansion? Are there limits? That kind of thing, I think, is the level of detail that we don't necessarily have, and that might be asked about with, could you make an explicit statement that says, when we say we're going to allow for greater design guidelines, or we are going to trust your judgment. If it passes your state review, if it passes your local review, then we're going to assume it's eligible. Those are things we don't quite know at that level of detail.
And I also spoke a little jargon there. Adaptive reuse would be like converting hotels, motels, or an empty building that was used for something previously into affordable housing. So
yep. The best we can tell so far, and I appreciate everyone allowing me to put caveats on this because it is still new. People are working on it nonstop, but it is still new, is the notion that in general, the populations that would be served in an adaptive reuse building, like Christine just described, are exactly the folks who have been most disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So their needs immediately qualify. The question is, are there any caveats on how the building is financed? Are there, what is the loan term? If the loan term extends beyond 2026, which is the deadline for spending all the fiscal recovery funds, that may render a project ineligible for receiving fiscal recovery funds if their loan term is longer. We know that many projects have far longer loan terms than 5 years, right? So those kinds of things are really those devils in the details that we would need to understand. And then also, if that were part of a project that was not just housing affordability, but had other elements to it, would some of those elements be more or less eligible for different parts of the provisions that aren't just housing affordability, redevelopment or expansion? So.
And you hit on a question that we have in the chat, and that was also on my radar as well. And when I read the final rule, most funds repaid, if it's a loan, repaid by 2026. But a couple of questions. How is Enterprise interpreting, and maybe you're not, maybe this is a question you have for Treasury, but the utilization of loan funds, because across the country, I see states proposing, if not allocating their FRF dollars, their fiscal recovery funds for loan funds, which makes sense, right? We want something now that can help us, but also be sustainable and go into the future for long lasting impacts. How are you interpreting that? Is Treasury going to take it back once it's repaid? Can we then put it out to work again? Does it have to be repaid by 2026?
So, and I see and I appreciate those in the chat who have talked about how they are interpreting these provisions, because they're really important. So because a number of advocacy organizations had worked together to request more flexibility so that we wouldn't have some of these uncertainties, and that explicit eligibility was not provided in the final rule, we all want to get just more explicit black and white clarity. So there is this question that is highly technical for those who are not directly in the field regarding the eligible basis. If the money is provided from fiscal recovery funds as a grant versus as a revolving loan versus as a potentially forgivable loan, which is effectively a grant in the future, right? Are there differences in terms of the triggering requirements for fiscal recovery funds? There are certainly implications for how the project itself is financed, but there are just, is it eligible if it is a loan, and is that and if it's a revolving repaid back loan that could then be recycled in through another trust fund deal, or is it we're going to give money that's a grant? Gap financing as a grant, not explicitly allowed for projects that are financed with longer terms than loan maturity at 2026. So we're not comfortable saying that we know whether or not that would be the case, but I appreciate that there are folks in the chat who are interpreting it a certain way. And I think that's part of why we really feel Treasury is going to need to be explicit, because we'd love for it to be eligible, but we don't have agreement nationally with experts in the field on exactly how everything can be interpreted.
Awesome. One final question. I promise everyone, we're really shooting for 12:45. I'm not even going to add more things. But two final questions. One is, can you share your contact? Can people contact you directly, or?
Of course.
Great.
Absolutely. Would you like me to put that into the chat?
Yes, if you don't mind.
Of course.
And then final question, and I think this actually is helpful too, regarding whether federal prevailing wages are triggered using the fiscal recovery funds for construction, and if so, under what circumstances. Of course, that impacts potentially some of our local builders and contractors in having that capacity, right, to be a part of deploying the funds and activating them for affordable housing. Potentially not. We've done it before.
That's right. So I will say, in the giant document from Treasury, the words prevailing wage do not appear. So that's one, because I'm not an attorney and because I'm not responsible for being able to answer that question with legal certainty, I'm going to say I don't know, but that is something that others within enterprise certainly would know, and I will ask them. And if it's okay, if the person who asked that question is in contact directly, Christine and Amanda, with you, I will be glad to try and provide that information via email. But if you look at the final rule itself, the issue of prevailing wage is not explicitly outlined, so we don't know.
Great, thank you. Yes, we would love that question. No,
So.
And I know that there's still a lot of unknowns, but I do think that this was helpful in terms of clarifying what we do know now that the final rule is out. And I do know, that our leaders are looking at the final rule just as the coalition is. As people have questions too, if you want to reach out to me, I'll be collecting questions as well, that I, whether I send them to enterprise too, but that we'll make sure that we're forwarding on behalf of Nevada affordable housing advocates, those wanting to develop, build more, different income levels, how that might look for us. So please feel free to also reach out and share those with us. But thank you, Melissa, for putting your information in the chat. My guess is you're going to get some questions directly, so sure appreciate your time. And thank you, Treasurer, for being on with us again, such a housing champion through this pandemic, and we really appreciate you and your team. And with that, I will let everyone go. So thank you so much.